Now, for the first time, the government has admitted that colonial forces tortured and sexually abused Kenyan detainees during the Mau Mau uprising 60 years ago. The Foreign Office has spent years refusing to face up to the atrocities, but dramatically changed tack today as 3 elderly Kenyans began suing the government at the High Court. The case could lead to a flood of similar compensation claims from around the world. In a moment, we'll ask if it's right that 21st century Britain should pay for the crimes of a previous generation. First, though, James Blake has this report, which does contain some distressing details.
It has taken nearly 60 years for their day in court. In their youth, they were accused of being part of the Mau Mau rebellion against British rule in Kenya before they were arrested and detained in labour camps. In court, the government made an admission they had hoped for but didn't expect.
The government does not dispute that each of the claimants suffered torture and other ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. I do not dispute that terrible things happened.
They knew it. They wanted only to deny. If they agree now that we were tortured, it's a great thing. We would appreciate the generation of today here in UK, that they are just a generation by admitting that, because that was the thing. And that is the justice we have been trying to come here and get in England.
Their written testimonies to court make difficult reading, accusing British officials of castration, mutilation, assault and massacres during the emergency in Kenya in the 1950s.
Apart from the serious beatings, there were women who were burned with hot spades. I remember seeing clear burn marks on their backs in the shape of a spade.
As time went by and I witnessed more and more torture and people being beaten until they were unconscious and bleeding, I felt mentally weaker and weaker and more traumatised.
The Mau Mau rebels mostly came from the Kikuyu tribe. Painted as brutal terrorists by the British, others saw them as fighting the vanguard for an independent Kenya. But in the dying days of empire, dozens of camps were set up and run by the British and Kenyan loyalists. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned, sometimes for years, with no trials. A young British officer in Kenya at the time was in court today.
I thought the camps as such were a horrible thing. But what was far worse than even them was the way in which the people who were in them were being treated by the warders and the prison officers.
Now that the government has finally accepted there was torture and ill treatment in Kenya during the 1950s and 60s, the question turns to who exactly was responsible. The Foreign Office has blamed the colonial administration, but what do the documents of the time say? The trouble is, most of the crucial documents were destroyed. 3.5 tons of papers went up in flames in 1963. Today, the court heard the British government at the time blocked investigations into abuse and ordered evidence to be disposed of. Some documents have recently come to light, which the Kenyan claimants say will show clear involvement by British officials. But the British government now argues that the allegations are too old, a court case would be too complicated, and a fair trial is not possible.
Well, I'm joined in the studio by Nigel Farage, leader of the UK Independence Party, and from Boston by Professor Caroline Elkins, a leading authority on the Mau Mau uprising, who's submitted a statement to the High Court on this case. Caroline Elkins first, why is it so important in your view that this case is getting heard?
It's significantly important. You know, such situations are immensely complicated. But in this instance, it is so abundantly clear that tortures and brutalities took place, that extraordinary levels were taken by British colonial officials, both in Kenya and London, to cover it up at the time, and subsequently for the decades after that to cover it up. And then when this case is filed, these individuals who were validated today so historically were at first called liars. And so this is a situation where history is going to judge.
Nigel Farage, it's a particularly dark episode in British colonial history, isn't it? It's right that, if appropriate, we should atone for that.
Well, without doubt. And indeed, back in the 1950s, there were brave members of Parliament who stood up and spoke out against the British government, the British Army, and what we did. So there's no doubt we got things wrong and did things very badly. But the difficulty is, beyond issuing a full apology, the thought that we should launch upon a series of trials that could go on forever You know, evidence that is given in court 6 decades after the alleged atrocities is very unreliable, and we've got a very bad precedent for this. In '91, we passed the War Crimes Act in this country. There were several hundred attempted prosecutions of Nazi war criminals. It cost £6 million and led to 1 prosecution. And I would argue we've got better things to do with our judicial system.
Caroline Elkins, 6 decades have passed and many of the British taxpayers weren't alive when these alleged atrocities were committed. So why should this generation pay?
Well, you know, I think as individuals and as nations, we inherit the good and the bad and everything in between from previous generations. You know, and I would disagree insofar as, you know, the British government has had multiple opportunities to apologize. They had an opportunity at the time to apologize in the 1950s, and I completely agree. Brave members of parliament were called liars.
Yeah.
And for decades after that, a similar kind of thing. And most recently, when incontrovertible evidence is presented, again, individuals are called liars. And the British government, in this particular instance with this case, could have stopped the expenditure of British taxpayer money by simply doing the right thing when the case was filed, and they have refused to do so.
Nigel Farage.
I would agree with that. You know, it is time for the British government to fully, openly apologise and to say we got things very badly wrong, we're sorry, but there is no point going through a lengthy, costly judicial process. The evidence won't be reliable.
It's not just about justice, is it? It's a question of, you know, there's been a cover-up here, reams of documents destroyed, gone missing.
Well, I think
history may have to be rewritten.
Well, I think, again, it would be quite right for the government to admit that things were covered up, that things were done very badly wrong, and let's move on, and let's try and make the Commonwealth, of which, of course, Kenya is a member, a big success.
Caroline Elkins, what about the precedent this sets, a flood of similar compensation claims from around the world? We can't possibly foot the bill for all of those, can we?
No, I think it's a very fair question. I do believe, though, that the Kenyan case is somewhat particular. In the Kenyan instance, there has been a great deal of historical research, most recently by myself and 1 or 2 others, that really laid the groundwork for this case, such that when these files were quote-unquote discovered, quite heroically, by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, we had a way of interpreting them and understanding them, such that we understood these files to represent not one-off cases of abuse, but rather systematic abuse. I think in the cases of other colonies, whether it be Malaya or Cyprus or Palestine, take your pick, I think it's going to be much more difficult to prove.
Nigel Farage.
But I mean, come on, you know, all over the world. I mean, we could do this with the Americans with Vietnam. We could have veterans of Changi and the Burma Railway going to court in Tokyo against the Japanese government. I mean, where does this end? Surely there comes a point with these things where so much time has elapsed that it's time to apologise, admit things have been done wrong, and to move on.
Caroline Elkins, what about the British prisoners of war who've got no hope of a similar hearing in Japan, for example?
Well, sure. I mean, listen, each instance, you know, each case has its own merits, right? But I think one cannot lose sight of the fact that this is a rather extraordinary case. As you pointed out in some of the preview to this piece, the Mau Mau were portrayed as the most savage, horrible, bestial thing by the British colonial government, at the same time that they are torturing them and covering it up. And then they spend decades doing this, decades, covering their tracks, destroying records, but the problem is that all good purgers leave something behind. And so I do think that this case is exceptional. I do think that the behavior on the part of the British government has been, quite frankly, abhorrent from start to finish.
Quick final word.
Agreed, but you know, just look at what the Belgians did in the Congo and every other European power in Africa. We all did things in the past that we now would think were absolutely wrong. We should hold our hands up, say we're sorry, but for the British to have to launch upon a series of legal cases like this, frankly, is a waste of time and money.
Nigel Farage, Caroline Elkins, thank you both very much.